Hello, students. Today we're going to be talking about thriving or declining. I'm going to be doing a PowerPoint for you, and I'm going to ask you to stop the video at various points and write some things in your notes. Is the North American Jewish community thriving or declining? Now, it's not a yes or no, black or white question. These are poles of a continuum from declining to thriving. And I want you to start with a little writing exercise or drawing exercise. Where do you locate yourself along this continuum? And then think about an organization that you've worked for. Where are your colleagues, your lay leaders, your donors? So take a minute, pause the video, and do that exercise for yourself. Welcome back. Now, these are both narratives and ideologies. There is not a right answer. My personal narrative is that the American Jewish community is mostly thriving, with some caveats, but I'm going to present multiple narratives for you, and I want you to think about which narrative speaks to you for each of the aspects that I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about the narratives in general, and then I'll give you overall population statistics. We'll talk about denominations, age trends, new forms of Jewish engagement, and intermarriage. The goals for this session are for you to recognize competing narratives in Jewish communal life, and for you to gain more experience analyzing and interpreting demographic and sociological trends and statistics. And all of this is to add to your toolkit as Jewish professionals. So let's start with some responses to the Pew study. Now, of course, the Pew Research Center has done many studies, but when Jewish communal professionals talk about the Pew study, they're usually talking about the Pew study of Jewish Americans from 2013. A new study will be coming out soon, but we're going to be focusing on the data from 2013. Now, when this study came out, there were very interesting responses in the press. The New York Times reported a 71% intermarriage rate, which was an interesting statistic because that wasn't even in the report itself. The report itself had many statistics, but 71% was not one of them. It turns out that was the percentage of non-Orthodox Jews who have married in the last 10 years. And I suspect that was the highest number that they could find, and therefore selected that as the number to report as the big finding of this study. Jane Eisner, the editor of the Forward at the Times, wrote, "There is no persuasive way to sugarcoat these devastating findings." Stephen Cohen wrote, "Orthodox birth rates in just the last few years have been soaring. The sky is falling for the rest of the population." And Jack Wertheimer wrote, "It's a very grim portrait of the health of the American Jewish population in terms of their Jewish identification." Now, I was on the advisory board for this study, and I had seen the results before it was released to the public, and I had been also been asked for my response to the study, but my response was completely different. My response was, wow, it's amazing that so many Jews still identify as Jews, participate in Jewish life, and marry other Jews. Now, why is this? Well, it's because of our Jewish communal institutions. Our synagogues, schools, youth groups, Hillels, and other Jewish organizations are creating opportunities for Jews to get to know other Jews. A common narrative in relation to this kind of thriving or declining question is the Humpty Dumpty narrative. Now, I'm sure you know the nursery rhyme, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All of the king's horses and all of the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Okay, I got that one. So Humpty Dumpty narrative applied to Jewish life is something like this. The wall is old country Jewishness. Jews started out with a certain type of Jewishness that they brought from the old country. And then in America, they declined. And the king's horses and men that can't fix the problem are Jewish organizations. They're trying their best, but they just can't fix it. So this Humpty Dumpty narrative is pretty common in American Jewish life today. On the other side of this ideological spectrum is something like this from Calvin Goldscheider. We must begin to reorient our perspective to emphasize that the Jewish community in the United States is not eroding and disintegrating. American Jewish culture is vibrant and creative and thoroughly American. So this is taking the same facts, the same statistics, and really thinking about them in much more optimistic ways. And in fact, we might compare these narratives with various other words. So the narrative of thriving is sometimes called thrivalism in contrast to survivalism. And the way that the different perspectives look at change is change as good or normal versus change as loss. And then sometimes people think of it in terms of transformationism and traditionalism, the idea that it's good to change or that it's good to keep traditions as they have been. And sometimes people just talk about it as optimism or pessimism. So how are these narratives applied practically? Well, individuals and groups with any ideological orientation can use sociological data to support their position and their work. And that's the case with Jewish sacred texts as well, which you'll learn next year more about in your Applied Jewish Wisdom class. And I'm sure you're learning a bit more about that now in Josh Garraway's class. So an example of this is what happened after the Pew study came out. Organizations of many, many types used the findings to support what they were doing. And sometimes it was to support their recruitment to their organization or their fundraising. What we're doing is great, so give us money. Or sometimes things like this. Chabad celebrated the decline in denominational self-identification. Why? Because that's what Chabad is all about, not being part of a denomination. The LA Federation talked about a crisis of assimilation based on the Pew study, and therefore you should join our work to counter these trends. Now, one thing you should know is that these issues and these problems are not just in existence a priori. They are socially constructed, meaning they wouldn't exist if we didn't talk about them, right? In fact, some communities have a very high intermarriage rate, but don't consider it a problem. In fact, they might even consider it a good thing that their group has integrated into American society and is seen as desirable enough for people to intermarry with. And of course, in some elements of the Jewish community, some corners, people don't consider intermarriage to be a problem. They consider it a good thing. So we'll see how this plays out in various aspects. So let's start with population statistics. Well, some people say the Jewish community is increasing in size, and others say the Jewish community is decreasing. Well, which is it? Let's take a look at some statistics. The American Jewish Population Project found that there are 7.1 to 7.8 million Jews in the United States. 74% of them are Jews by religion. Those other people, the other 26% are Jews of no religion, meaning people who answer the question, what is your religion? With nothing, or atheist or agnostic, but not Jewish. And then they answer, I am Jewish aside from religion. Okay, so if you look at these populations, the total number of Jews and the JBRs, the Jews by religion, you see that they have actually gone up from 2015 to 2018. But it depends who you're considering a Jew. In fact, the Pew study itself gives you many ways to count. They give you this nice little calculator, and I recommend that you go to the Google Pew Jewish Americans and you'll find this handy dandy calculator where you can click which group you want to consider to be Jews for your count of the American Jewish population. Now, it's also important to note that the people who say they are Jewish on these studies, it's not really an estimate of how many Jews there are. It's an estimate of how many people in this country tell a phone surveyor that they are Jewish and not also Christian, unless you click both Christian, unless you click people who are Christian and Jewish as part of your set here. Also, there's an important rise that we need to think about, which is the rise of people who are part Jewish. We'll talk more about that a little later. So we also see that there's this increasingly porous boundary between Jews and non-Jews. And so that's why it's so hard to come up with a statistic. And so some estimates are 7.5 million and some are 5.6 million. It just depends on who you're counting. So people who are part Jewish or have Jewish ancestry or who are Jew adjacent, maybe they're married to a non-Jew, haven't converted, but they consider themselves to be Jewish because they're married to a non-Jew, or people who just say, I'm Jewish for whatever reason, even if they didn't convert. So it's probably easier to think about it in this center periphery model, this idea that there is a center of the Jewish community, and then there's a periphery with people who are Jew adjacent or have Jewish ancestry but don't consider themselves Jewish, and then non-Jews who have no claim to Jewishness or connection to Jewishness outside of that periphery model. Well, having these porous boundaries can be interpreted in different ways. Some people would say these increasingly porous boundaries are necessary and enable the continued thriving of Jews in North America. And others would say the increasingly porous boundaries are evidence of decline. If they're thinking about the Humpty Dumpty narrative, where people in Europe or in the Middle East had a very distinctive Jewish identity and there wasn't as much of this porousness of boundaries, then in America, when the boundaries become more porous, it can be seen as decline. Pause here, and I want you to locate yourself along this continuum for this particular issue of the overall US Jewish population statistics. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about denomination. So in the US, here are the statistics for the various denominations as of 2013. And you see that the Reform movement is still the largest, but no denomination is very close behind. And in fact, no denomination is growing, and so is Orthodox. Why is the Orthodox denomination growing? Well, look at the age statistics here. You see that the conservative movement, the Reform movement are lower for the youngest age group, ages 18 to 29. Orthodox is a bit higher. No denomination is much higher. And that has to do with intermarriage, primarily, with people who are children of intermarriage not being involved with synagogues or not considering themselves to be part of any particular denomination. But the Orthodox rate is also related to the number of children that they have. This is the average number of children in each denomination among women ages 40 to 59. And you see that Orthodox Jews tend to have more children, and especially true in Hasidic and other Haredi or Black Hat Orthodox communities. In fact, 27% of Jewish children live in Orthodox homes, compared to that 10% of the population that considers themselves Orthodox. So because of these large families, the percentage of Jews of the overall population who are Orthodox will likely continue to grow. So some might interpret this in different ways, that the increase in no denomination is evidence that Jews are creating new forms of Jewish religious life. And there is this major increase in the numbers of Orthodox Jews and Haredi Jews. And then some might look at the decrease in the percentage of conservative and Reform affiliated Jews and say that is evidence of decline. So pause here and indicate in your notes your thoughts about where you are on this continuum for denomination. Welcome back. We'll now look at Jewish engagement trends. Some talk about increased participation in youth groups, summer camps, Israel experience, and religious life. And then others talk about young Jews' lower levels of engagement with Jewish communal life and Israel and synagogues. Well, it's hard to actually have any specific statistics about this because there are so many new groups that have popped up. But we have some statistics. So here I'm giving you a comparison to Canada just so you can see how the US compares. So Canada is red and the US is yellow. And we see that Jews in Canada tend to be much more engaged overall. And here I'm giving you statistics about age versus life stage. I want you to pause it here and look at the difference between age and life stage and try to figure out how they compare. So you probably noticed that the differences between the darker line and the lighter line are much bigger in life stage than age. When we're talking about Jews who are older doing Jewish things more than Jews who are younger, it's much more about life stage than about how old they are. Those who have school-age children are much more likely to do things like volunteering in a Jewish context, attending adult Jewish education, attending high holiday services, than those who are unmarried and have no kids. But interestingly, when we look at age trends, we're seeing a combination of historical changes, especially intermarriage, and life stage effects. Let me explain what I mean by that. The delayed age of marriage can lead to what seems like a decline in engagement. And in fact, this is a broader American trend. A lot of the trends that we talk about in American Jewish life are actually trends in America in general. There is a crisis in church attendance. It's socially constructed there too. They consider it a crisis among young adults. Why? It's because they're marrying later, and it's not the norm to go to church when you're out of college and before you are married and have children. Here is the percentage of Jews in America who say that being Jewish is very important. What do you notice? A decline as Jews get younger. So older Jews are more likely to say this than younger Jews. We see the same decline in the percent that say that most of their close friends are Jewish, the percent that made a donation to a Jewish organization in the past year, the percent that say they are somewhat or very attached to Israel. But this one is different. Look, you saw this, made a donation to Jewish organization, and then this, somewhat or very attached to Israel. Wow, the youngest age group is almost the same as the next age group. What's going on there? Well, that's the birthright bump, right? Birthright really has made an impact on Jews feeling attachment to Israel. So all of these trends I've been talking about so far are ethnic identity markers. I mean, the word ethnic is complicated here, right? But they're not religious, right? None of these things have to do specifically with religion. And here are some ways that you might interpret this. You might say, well, changes in orientation are inevitable and beneficial given Jews' integration into American society and the high rates of intermarriage. Or you might say, these age patterns are evidence of decline, right? But wait, there's more. Before I tell you to pause, I have to tell you about religious trends. So trends that have to do with religious life are actually pretty stable. This is the percent who say they attend services at least monthly. This is the percent who participated in a Seder last year. And this is the percent that keep kosher in their home. Look at that. The religious identity markers, in contrast to the ethnic identity markers, are actually mostly stable or even somewhat increasing. But even some ethnic markers are relatively stable. Take a look at some data from various city studies. There are Jewish population studies overall, like the Pew study and the National Jewish Population Study from 1991 and 2000, but then there are also many studies in local Jewish communities. So, for example, we see this in Pittsburgh, in DC, in South Palm Beach County, where we see there aren't really strong age trends in one particular direction. This is about the percent that talk about Jewish topics weekly or more, the percent that engage in Jewish culture weekly or more. And in fact, the youngest group in Pittsburgh is much higher than the others. The percent that eat Jewish food weekly or more. And this is actually the only significant age trend that was found in this study. In South Palm Beach County, younger Jews are less likely to eat Jewish foods. Okay, so that's one age trend in these ethnic behaviors or cultural behaviors out of all of the ones that were tested. So I want you to pause there and write down what you think about your location on this continuum with regard to age trends. Now I want to talk about new initiatives. There are so many new initiatives in every domain of Jewish life. Now, this will probably change over the next few months and years because of the current crisis. We will see some new organizations that arise specifically to deal with the crisis or elements of it. And we will probably see the decline of some organizations that have popped up recently and some that are more long-standing. So there are many new education initiatives in the field of Jewish education. And you can see this in different ways. Ooh, there's increased interest in Jewish learning, and the percentage of Jewish adults who have attended Jewish day schools is increasing. But then you can say, oh, wow, we have low levels of Jewish and Hebrew knowledge and literacy, and there's a watering down of Jewish education and literary allusions, and people don't know as much as they used to know. There are new initiatives regarding Israel from the right, from the left, from the center, from a perspective of dialogue and from a perspective of education and visiting Israel and talking about Israel and advocating for Israel. And people say, wow, this is the explosion in Israel advocacy engagement and the rise of progressive Israel groups like J Street and If Not Now are examples of good things. And some who think that those are bad would consider them to be evidence of decline. And also people might consider it decline the increasing polarization that we'll talk more about in a few weeks, and the rise of anti-Zionism and BDS among Jews being something that is really bad for the Jews. We also see many new initiatives in Jewish music, some of which are hybrid musical forms. We see new initiatives in JOFEE, Jewish Outdoor Food and Environmental Education, and there are new institutions like this that have popped up all around the country in the last several years. There are also new organizations on the margins of orthodoxy, such as Maharat, Shamayim V'Aretz Institute, which is about animals and veganism. And those who are formerly Orthodox have some options now, like Footsteps and Off the Derech. And there are new initiatives surrounding race. Jews of color organizations and organizations that educate about the diversity of the Jewish people. So wow, we can look at these new initiatives and say there's all this innovation, there's diversification in communal engagement, education, ritual, and culture, especially in cities. And it's great to see all this diversity by race, national origin, LGBT, etc. And that our communities are becoming much more welcoming, and we have more communal infrastructure for all of this. But on the other side of this continuum, you could see this as evidence of decline of long-standing Jewish organizations, including federations. If people are giving their attention and their dollars to all of these new organizations, then some of the long-standing and more centralized organizations might suffer. And you might say these innovative, creative engagements with tradition and peoplehood are evidence of thriving. Or you could say these newfangled initiatives are inauthentic compared to the real Jewish culture created in the old country, that Humpty Dumpty narrative again. You could say that these new initiatives are engaging many young Jews who feel alienated by establishment Jewish organizations. Or you could say, well, yeah, but they're only engaging a small percentage of Jews, and the rest will not raise Jewish children and will be lost for good. So pause here and take a minute to see where you find yourself on this continuum with regard to new initiatives. And finally, we're going to talk about intermarriage. You might say that intermarriage increases the number of households that have Jews. Take a minute and think about that. if there are two Jews, a man and a woman, and they marry each other and they have a child, then that household is one Jewish household. If these two Jews, the man marries a Jewish man and the woman marries a non-Jewish man, then these two households are both Jewish, some more than others, and they now have two Jewish households from those two Jews, right? And you could also say that it demonstrates Americans' acceptance of Jews. Wow, so many non-Jews are willing to marry Jews. That is evidence of acceptance. Now, you could also, of course, say, whoa, intermarriage is bad for Jewish continuity. People are no longer Jews if their parents aren't raising them as Jews and they don't consider themselves Jews because they married a non-Jew. So let's take a look a little bit more closely at this statistic. Well, there's a lot of recent scholarship on intermarriage that analyzes new hybrid practices and identities among interfaith families. And some of the things that they found are the labels are changing, right? People aren't just considering themselves Jewish or Christian. They might consider themselves Jewish and Christian, or multi-faith, multi-heritage, part Jewish, or half Jewish. And you could look at these new identities and say, whoa, these new hybrid identities and practices are necessary and positive adaptations, or these newfangled identities and practices are offensive. You're either Jewish or you're not. And some people do use the analogy of pregnancy for that. You're either pregnant or you're not half pregnant. Now, even scholars have diverse approaches to statistics on intermarriage and implications for Jewish communal policy. And if you're interested in these different approaches, I can refer you to some studies, because it is really interesting how sometimes they take very similar findings and have different analyses of them. But I just want to point out one study, which is by Bruce Phillips, who is our colleague here at HUC. And if you would like to meet him, he's very generous with his time. I'm happy to make a connection. He distinguishes between mixed ancestry Jews and single ancestry Jews. Mixed ancestry, meaning they have one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent, and single ancestry Jews, meaning both of their parents are Jewish, okay? So what he found is that mixed ancestry Jews, the intermarriage rate is really high, but it went up in the decade that the marriage began, right? If the marriage began in the 1960s, it was pretty high among those who had mixed Jewish ancestry and pretty low among those with single Jewish ancestry. And it's remained that way. Those who have two Jewish parents are pretty likely to marry another Jew, and those who have one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent are pretty likely to marry another non-Jew. And that was from the 2000 NJPS, but the Pew study from 2013 found something similar, but a little bit more overlap in some of the decades. But basically, we still find that these patterns are similar. Now the question is, are these rates high? Well, Bruce Phillips addresses this by asking, well, compared to what? He found that single ancestry Jews are more likely than all racial groups except African Americans to in-marry. Now I know this is complicated because Jews are not a racial group, right? But he's comparing Jews to racial groups. I mean, the question of whether Jews are a racial group, anti-Semites have a different response to that question, and historically Jews were classified as racial groups, as we saw from that document that we looked at last time. But anyway, looking at Jews in comparison to people who are Black, Asian, non-white Hispanic, white Hispanic, we see that single ancestry Jews are more likely than all racial groups except African Americans to marry other Jews, to in-marry, right? Wow, that when I first heard that statistic, I was really surprised based on the discourse within the Jewish community of how bad intermarriage is and how it is so anomalous. It's actually quite similar to what is happening in other groups, and in fact Jews intermarry less than most groups. But we have something interesting going on here. Population studies, like the Pew study, include both single ancestry and mixed ancestry Jews. And so Based on this, the Jewish population seems to be increasing in size, and many measures of engagement seem to be declining, right? If the population studies only included single ancestry Jews, people with 2 Jewish parents, then it would seem like the population was decreasing in size, and it would seem like many measures of engagement were increasing, right? But because there are so many children of intermarriage included in these studies, you get these statistics here. So that's it. Now I want you to think about this continuum again that we've been talking about throughout, and I want you to write 2 paragraphs in your notes. I'm not going to collect it, but we will discuss it in class in our discussion. My question is, do you have different answers for some trends than for others? And I want you to think of an organization that you've been involved with. How are they responding to these trends? Should they change anything to respond more effectively to these trends?